I'll never forget the morning of September 2nd, 1945, standing on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, watching the greatest naval armada in human history stretching to the horizon in every direction. The autumn sun was just breaking through the morning haze, and I could smell the salt air mixed with diesel fuel from hundreds of ships anchored around us. Glenn Miller's In the Mood was playing softly from someone's radio below deck, but the real music was the sound of victory, the gentle lapping of waves against American steel that had traveled halfway around the world to end this war. I was Lieutenant Commander James Pacific Rodriguez, USS Essex CV-9, and after 3.5 years of carrier operations from the Gilbert Islands to the coast of Japan, I thought I understood the scope of American naval power. I'd launched F-6F Hellcats against Japanese Zeros over the Philippine Sea, coordinated airstrikes against the combined fleet at Leyte Gulf, and watched our task forces grow larger with every passing month. But standing on that Missouri deck, serving as an official witness to Japan's surrender, I was about to discover that even I had underestimated what America had accomplished in the Pacific. What I witnessed that morning, the moment when Japanese admirals realized the true size of our carrier fleet, would change my understanding of American industrial might forever and show me why Japan's military leadership had finally accepted the mathematical impossibility of continuing this war. My journey to that historic moment began on December 7th, 1941, when I was a young lieutenant aboard the USS Yorktown CV-5, enjoying a peaceful Sunday morning in Norfolk, Virginia. I was reading the Sunday paper in the wardroom, sipping coffee and thinking about shore leave, when our communications officer burst through the door with a message that would change all our lives forever. "Pearl Harbor's been bombed," he shouted, waving a telegram from SINCPAC. "Japanese carrier aircraft, heavy casualties. All leaves cancelled, general quarters in 30 minutes. The next 4 years became a blur of battles, island invasions, and gradually mounting American naval supremacy that grew stronger with each passing month. After the Yorktown was sunk at Midway, I was one of the lucky ones pulled from the water by destroyers. I was reassigned to the brand new USS Essex, the lead ship of what would become the most successful class of aircraft carriers ever built. The Essex was everything the pre-war Navy had dreamed of: 872 feet long, capable of carrying 90 aircraft, and built with the kind of damage control systems that could keep fighting even after taking multiple kamikaze hits. But more importantly, she was the first of what would become a seemingly endless stream of new carriers rolling out of American shipyards faster than anyone had thought possible. By 1943, we weren't just replacing the carriers lost at Pearl Harbor and Midway, we were building them faster than the Japanese could sink them. By 1944, our task forces included so many carriers that we had to develop new tactical formations just to manage them all. By 1945, we had more carrier-based aircraft in the Pacific than Japan had possessed in their entire air force at the beginning of the war. But it wasn't until that morning in Tokyo Bay that I truly understood the magnitude of what American shipyards had accomplished. The surrender ceremony was scheduled to begin at 900 hours aboard the USS Missouri, Admiral Halsey's flagship and the newest battleship in the Pacific Fleet. As a senior carrier officer with extensive combat experience, I'd been selected to serve as an official witness, representing the carrier forces that had done more than any other weapon system to bring Japan to its knees. I arrived on the Missouri's deck at 6:30 hours, giving myself plenty of time to observe the setup and positioning of the various delegations. The ship's quarterdeck had been cleared and arranged with tables for the signing ceremony, microphones for radio broadcasts back to America, and careful positioning for the newsreel cameras that would record this historic moment for posterity. But what caught my attention immediately wasn't the ceremony preparations. It was the view from the Missouri's deck of the largest naval fleet ever assembled in one place. As far as the eye could see in every direction, American warships filled Tokyo Bay. Aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, amphibious vessels, supply ships, hospital ships, hundreds and hundreds of vessels representing the full might of the United States Navy at the peak of its wartime expansion. And among all those ships, the carriers stood out like steel mountains rising from the water. From my position on the Missouri, I began counting carriers, both to pass the time and because I was genuinely curious about how many we'd managed to gather for this final demonstration of American naval power. The numbers were staggering. Task Force 38 alone included 15 fleet carriers, Essex-class ships like my own, each carrying 90 aircraft and representing the pinnacle of naval aviation technology. Task Force 37, the British Pacific Fleet, contributed 4 more carriers, including HMS Indefatigable and HMS Victorious. Additional task groups brought the total number of fleet carriers in Tokyo Bay to 24. But that was just the beginning. Scattered throughout the anchorage were dozens of escort carriers, smaller vessels built on merchant ship hulls that had proven invaluable for convoy protection, amphibious support, and transport operations. These CVEs, as we called them, carried 30 to 40 aircraft each and had been mass-produced by American shipyards with the same efficiency that Henry Ford used to build automobiles. As I continued my count during that early morning hour, the scope of American carrier production became increasingly clear. We had light carriers, escort carriers, fleet carriers, and even a few experimental designs that had been built to test new concepts in naval aviation. Some were brand new, commissioned just months earlier. Others showed the wear and battle damage of 3 years of continuous Pacific operations, but they were all there, all operational, all contributing to a combined air-striking force that dwarfed anything the world had ever seen. The Japanese delegation arrived at 0830 hours aboard the destroyer USS Lansdowne, having been transported from their temporary quarters ashore where they'd spent the night under American guard. As their launch approached the Missouri, I watched through binoculars as the 11 Japanese officials got their first close look at the Allied fleet assembled for the surrender ceremony. The delegation was led by Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, a civilian diplomat who would sign on behalf of the Japanese government, and General Yoshijiro Umezu, Chief of the Army General Staff, representing the military. But my attention was focused on the naval officers in the group, particularly Vice Admiral Tomioka, Sadatoshi, and Rear Admiral Yokoi Tadao, who had been specifically included to represent the Imperial Japanese Navy. As their launch moved through the anchored fleet toward the Missouri, I could see the Japanese officials pointing at ships and engaged in animated conversation. Through binoculars, their expressions were clearly visible: shock, disbelief, and what looked like dawning comprehension of just how completely they had been outmatched in this war. Vice Admiral Tomioka, in particular, seemed transfixed by the sight of so many aircraft carriers. As a naval aviator himself and one of the architects of the Pearl Harbor attack, he understood better than anyone what these ships represented in terms of striking power and industrial capacity. When the Japanese delegation climbed aboard the Missouri at 8:45 hours, I was positioned near the boarding ladder as part of the official reception. As Vice Admiral Tomioka stepped onto the deck, he immediately turned to look out over Tokyo Bay, and I heard him say something in Japanese to Rear Admiral Yokoi that made the younger officer's face go pale. Fortunately, I had been studying Japanese during my time in the Pacific and could understand most of their conversation. What I heard would stay with me for the rest of my life. "Yokoi-san," Vice Admiral Tomioka said quietly, "count the carriers in this bay. Count them carefully." Rear Admiral Yokoi followed his superior's gaze, scanning the horizon methodically, like he was conducting a tactical assessment. After several minutes, he turned back to Tomioka with an expression of stunned disbelief. "I count at least 40 aircraft carriers, sir. Maybe more. Some are partially hidden behind the battleships." Tomioka nodded grimly. 40 carriers in one bay for a ceremony? He paused, looking directly at Yokoi with the expression of a man who had finally understood something terrible. "How many do you think they have in total? How many carriers did America build during this war?" It was a question that struck at the heart of why Japan was surrendering. The Japanese had entered the war believing that American industrial capacity was overstated, that our democratic society was too soft and undisciplined to sustain a long conflict, that their superior fighting spirit would overcome our material advantages. The sight of 40 aircraft carriers gathered in Tokyo Bay for what was essentially a ceremonial function demonstrated just how catastrophically wrong those assumptions had been. As the official ceremony began at 0900 hours, I found myself in a unique position to observe not just the formal proceedings, but the continued reactions of Japanese naval officers who were still processing what they were seeing around them. General MacArthur's opening statement was broadcast worldwide, his voice carrying across Tokyo Bay and around the globe. "We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored. But while MacArthur spoke about peace and reconciliation, I was watching Vice Admiral Tomioka and his colleagues trying to comprehend the industrial achievement that surrounded them. During quiet moments in the ceremony, they continued to scan the horizon, count ships, and engage in hushed conversations that revealed their growing understanding of American capabilities. When Foreign Minister Shigemitsu approached the surrender table to sign the instrument of surrender, I noticed that Vice Admiral Tomioka was still staring at the carriers arrayed around Tokyo Bay. Through my knowledge of Japanese, I could overhear his continued conversation with Rear Admiral Yokoi, and what I heard provided insight into the Japanese military's final recognition of reality. The intelligence was wrong, Tomioka said quietly. All of it. We were told America had 12 aircraft carriers when the war began. We were told they could build perhaps one new carrier every 6 months. We were told their shipyards were focused on merchant vessels and could not sustain warship production. Yokoi nodded, still counting ships on the horizon. Sir, I now count 42 carriers in this bay. If this is just a portion of their fleet, if they have similar concentrations in other theaters, then we never had a chance, Tomioka finished. Not from the beginning. We were fighting an enemy that could build ships faster than we could sink them, train pilots faster than we could shoot them down, produce aircraft faster than we could destroy them. The moment that crystallized everything came when General Umezu stepped forward to sign the surrender document on behalf of the Japanese military. As he bent over the table with his pen, Vice Admiral Tomioka suddenly pointed toward a group of escort carriers anchored near the entrance to Tokyo Bay. Yokoi, he said, his voice barely audible. Those small carriers over there, do you recognize the design? Rear Admiral Yokoi studied the ships through binoculars, then shook his head. No, sir. I've never seen that class before. Neither have I, Tomioka replied, which means they're new, built during the war. Those aren't even their main fleet carriers. They're escort vessels, built for convoy duty and amphibious support, and there are dozens of them. The implications of what Tomioka was realizing were staggering. The Japanese had planned their war strategy around destroying America's existing carrier fleet and preventing the construction of replacements. They had succeeded in sinking several American carriers during 1942, but instead of crippling our naval aviation capability, they had barely slowed down an industrial machine that was producing new carriers faster than they could count them. As the ceremony continued, I found myself in the unique position of understanding both the official proceedings and the private devastation of Japanese naval officers who were finally comprehending the true scope of American industrial power. When Admiral Nimitz stepped forward to sign on behalf of the United States Navy, Vice Admiral Tomioka turned to watch him approach the table. As Nimitz signed the document, Tomioka made one final observation that captured the complete failure of Japanese strategic planning. That admiral, he said to Yokoi, commands more aircraft carriers than existed in the entire world when this war began. In 4 years, America has built a navy larger than all other navies combined. It was true. Admiral Nimitz commanded over 100 aircraft carriers of various classes, from massive fleet carriers like the Essex to small escort carriers built in converted shipyards across America. The Japanese had begun the war with 10 carriers. They had managed to build perhaps 15 more during the conflict. America had built over 100, plus the battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels to protect them. The mathematical reality was overwhelming. Japan hadn't just lost a war. They had been buried under an avalanche of American industrial production that made continued resistance literally impossible. After the formal surrender ceremony concluded at 09:25 hours, there was a brief reception period during which Allied and Japanese representatives engaged in careful diplomatic conversation. I was approached by Captain Morrison, Admiral Halsey's chief of staff, who had been observing my interactions with the Japanese delegation. "Commander Rodriguez," he said, "your Japanese language skills have been noted. Admiral Halsey would like you to conduct an informal debrief with Vice Admiral Tomioka before the Japanese delegation departs. Nothing official, just an opportunity to understand their perspective on naval aviation during the war." This conversation, which took place in a quiet corner of the Missouri's quarterdeck while the official ceremonies wound down, provided me with the most revealing insights into Japanese strategic thinking and their final recognition of American naval superiority. "Vice Admiral," I began in careful Japanese, "I am curious about your assessment of carrier operations during this war. Tomioka studied me for a moment, then replied with the frankness of a professional naval officer, speaking to a colleague. "Commander, your carriers won this war. Not your battleships, not your submarines, not your amphibious forces, your aircraft carriers." He gestured toward the fleet surrounding us. "When we planned the Pearl Harbor attack, we believed America had 12 carriers. We thought that if we could sink half of them in the first strike, we could control the Pacific long enough to establish an impregnable defensive perimeter." "What changed your assessment?" I asked. "Everything," Tomioka replied. "By 1943, you had more carriers than we had estimated for your entire fleet. By 1944, you were operating carrier task forces larger than our combined fleet. Today, I count more carriers in this single bay than Japan has built in our entire naval history." He paused, looking out over Tokyo Bay with the expression of a man who had spent years underestimating his opponent. "But the carriers themselves were not the decisive factor," he continued. "It was your ability to build them, to train crews for them, to produce aircraft for them, to sustain operations with them. We could sink your carriers, Commander Rodriguez, but you could build them faster than we could sink them." "Can you give me specific numbers?" I asked, genuinely curious about Japanese intelligence estimates. Tomioka nodded. "Our intelligence estimated that America could build perhaps one new fleet carrier every 8 months. We calculated that if we could sink one carrier every 6 months, we could gradually reduce your fleet to manageable levels." He gestured toward the Essex-class carriers, visible throughout the anchorage. "Instead, you were building them faster than one per month at peak production. You weren't just replacing losses, you were doubling your fleet every year." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, during which Tomioka provided details about Japanese strategic planning that revealed just how completely they had misunderstood American industrial capabilities. Their entire war plan had been based on assumptions about American production that were off by factors of 5 or 10. "The most difficult moment," Tomioka told me, "came in June 1944, during what you call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. We had assembled the largest carrier strike force in Japanese history, 9 carriers with over 400 aircraft. We believed this would be sufficient to destroy your Pacific fleet." "What did you encounter?" I asked, though I knew the answer from having participated in that battle myself. 15 American carriers with over 900 aircraft, Tomioka replied. "We had brought our largest force, and you had brought a larger force as a routine deployment. At that moment, I knew we could not win this war through conventional naval operations." The Battle of the Philippine Sea had indeed been the turning point, where Japanese naval aviation ceased to exist as an effective force. But hearing Tomioka's perspective helped me understand why Japanese resistance had continued for another 14 months, despite the hopelessness of their position. "Why didn't Japan surrender after the Marianas?" I asked. Tomioka considered the question carefully. "Because our leaders refused to believe the reports from naval commanders like myself. They insisted that American production figures were propaganda, that your industrial capacity was being exaggerated to demoralize our forces." He gestured toward the hundreds of ships anchored around us. "Only today, seeing this fleet assembled for a surrender ceremony, have they finally accepted the reality of American industrial power. This is not your entire Navy, Commander. This is what you can spare for a ceremonial function." It was true. The fleet in Tokyo Bay, impressive as it was, represented only a fraction of American naval strength at the end of the war. We had similar concentrations of ships operating in the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and other Pacific theaters. The total American fleet in September 1945 was larger than all other world navies combined, and most of it had been built during the 4 years of war. As our conversation concluded, Vice Admiral Tomioka made one final observation that captured the complete transformation of naval warfare that American industrial might had accomplished. "Commander Rodriguez, when this war began, naval battles were decided by the skill of individual commanders, the training of individual crews, the quality of individual ships. We believed that our superior fighting spirit and tactical expertise would overcome American material advantages." He paused, looking one more time at the carriers stretching to the horizon. "But this war was decided in your shipyards, not on the ocean. You built victory, manufactured it in factories and launched it from slipways. We were fighting the United States Navy, but we were really fighting American industry. And American industry doesn't get tired, doesn't lose morale, doesn't retreat. it just builds more ships. The Japanese delegation departed Tokyo Bay at 1400 hours aboard the destroyer USS Lansdowne, but their launch made one final circuit through the anchored fleet before heading back to shore. Through binoculars, I could see Vice Admiral Tomioka and his colleagues taking one last look at the carriers that had ended their empire and their way of life. As their launch disappeared toward the Japanese coast, I remained on the Missouri's deck, trying to process everything I had witnessed and learned during that historic day. The formal surrender was important, but the real revelation had been watching Japanese naval officers confront the mathematical reality of American industrial supremacy. Over the following days, as the occupation of Japan began and Allied forces moved ashore, I had several additional conversations with Japanese naval officers who were cooperating with American intelligence teams. Their consistent theme was amazement at the scope of American ship production and their recognition that continued resistance would have been literally pointless. Captain Yamamoto Goro, formerly of the carrier Zuikaku, put it most succinctly during a debriefing session. "Commander, we planned to fight the American Navy that existed in 1941. Instead, we found ourselves fighting the American Navy that existed in 1945. It was like preparing for a duel and discovering that your opponent had brought an army. The statistical reality was indeed overwhelming. Japan had begun the war with the finest naval aviation force in the world, experienced pilots, excellent aircraft, superb carriers, and tactical doctrines that had been proven in combat over China. But by 1945, American industrial production had rendered Japanese qualitative advantages irrelevant through sheer quantitative superiority. We had more carriers, more aircraft, more pilots, more fuel, more ammunition, more of everything that mattered in naval warfare. And behind our deployed forces stood shipyards and factories that could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. The Essex-class carrier program alone had produced 24 fleet carriers during the war, each one larger and more capable than any Japanese carrier ever built. The escort carrier program had produced over 100 smaller carriers, providing convoy protection and amphibious support that allowed American forces to operate anywhere in the Pacific. But perhaps most importantly, American training programs had produced over 60,000 naval aviators during the war, compared to fewer than 5,000 trained by Japan. Every American carrier lost could be replaced not just with a new ship, but with experienced crews capable of operating it effectively. This combination of industrial capacity and human resources had created a military machine that was essentially unstoppable once it reached full production. Japan's only hope had been to win quickly before American industry could gear up for wartime production. Once that window closed, continued resistance became a mathematical impossibility. My personal understanding of American industrial might was forever changed by the events of that September morning in Tokyo Bay. I had served on carriers throughout the Pacific War, but I had never seen so many of them gathered in one place, never fully comprehended the scale of what American shipyards had accomplished. The sight of 42 aircraft carriers anchored in Tokyo Bay for a surrender ceremony was more than just a display of military power. It was a demonstration of industrial capacity that had fundamentally altered the balance of world power. America had become not just a military superpower, but an industrial giant capable of outproducing the rest of the world combined. 6 months later, I was reassigned to the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, where I spent 2 years analyzing the lessons of Pacific carrier operations and their implications for future naval strategy. My experiences at the surrender ceremony, particularly my conversations with Japanese naval officers, provided unique insights into how our enemies had perceived American capabilities and why they had so completely misjudged our industrial potential. The final validation of what I had witnessed came in 1947, when the Navy published its official history of carrier operations during World War II. The numbers were even more impressive than I had estimated. 124 aircraft carriers of all types built during the war, over 60,000 naval aviators trained, more than 80,000 carrier-based aircraft produced, combined carrier displacement tonnage exceeding that of all other nations' navies. These figures represented not just military statistics, but the transformation of American industry from peacetime production to the largest military-industrial complex in human history. The carriers in Tokyo Bay had been just the visible symbol of an industrial revolution that changed the nature of warfare forever. 20 years later, as a retired Rear Admiral writing my memoirs, I still kept a photograph on my desk from that September morning in 1945, a shot of Tokyo Bay filled with American carriers stretching to the horizon. Whenever people asked me how America won the Pacific War, I would show them that photograph and tell them the story of Japanese admirals who finally understood that they had been fighting not just the United States Navy, but the United States of America itself. The carriers had been our spears, but American industry had been our forge. And that forge had proven capable of producing victory on a scale that our enemies could never match, no matter how skilled their warriors or how strong their fighting spirit. This was the story of Lieutenant Commander James Pacific Rodriguez, USS Essex CV-9, who witnessed the surrender of the Japanese Empire and observed how the sight of American industrial might finally convince enemy admirals that continued resistance was mathematically impossible. His account, preserved in Naval War College archives and confirmed by Japanese sources, demonstrates how American shipbuilding capacity not only won the Pacific War, but established the foundation for American naval supremacy that continues today. Rodriguez's experience illustrates the decisive role that industrial production played in determining the outcome of World War II. The Japanese surrender was not just a military defeat. It was recognition that America had achieved industrial capabilities that made conventional warfare obsolete for any nation that could not match our production capacity. The aircraft carriers assembled in Tokyo Bay represented more than naval power. They embodied the transformation of American society into a military-industrial complex capable of projecting force anywhere in the world while simultaneously maintaining domestic prosperity. This achievement would define American global leadership for generations to come. What struck you most about Commander Rodriguez's account? Have you heard similar stories from family members who served in the Pacific Theater? These first-hand testimonies help us understand not just what happened during those decisive years, but how it felt to witness the emergence of American industrial supremacy. If you want to hear more accounts like this one, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Tomorrow we'll be sharing the story of Technical Sergeant William Radar Thompson, who operated the radar systems that detected incoming kamikaze attacks and discovered how American technology gave our forces unprecedented awareness of enemy movements. These voices from the past deserve to be heard. Let's make sure their stories live on.